Hello, everyone, and welcome. Bonjour, bienvenue. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Jaime Battiste, and it's my pleasure to serve as the MC for today's announcement. I want to start by acknowledging that we are fortunate to be able to gather here today in Ottawa on the traditional territory of many nations, including Algonquin, Anishinaabe First Nation, First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people. Thank you to everyone for being here today. It's an honor to present for the announcement of this extraordinary commitment to housing. I would like to let the media know that there will be an opportunity for a group photo of the speakers immediately following the Q&A session. To kick us off for today's wonderful announcement, on behalf of the federal government, is Honourable Ahmed Hussen, Minister of Housing and Diversity and Inclusion. The floor is yours, Minister Hussen.
Thank you very much, Jaime, and for that introduction, and for your advocacy and commitment to affordable housing across Canada. And it is a pleasure to be here alongside my colleagues, Ministers Hajdu and Miller, for this important announcement and for their advocacy. Thank you for your advocacy for a strong and more inclusive housing sector in Canada. Today, we're taking a crucial step towards ensuring that Indigenous communities across Canada have access to safe and affordable housing. There is no relationship more important to the Government of Canada than the one with Indigenous peoples. And it is why we're committed to implementing the Truth and Reconciliation calls to action. And as we continue on the path of reconciliation, it is vital that we work hand in hand with Indigenous communities to empower their voices, uplift their perspectives, and promote their prosperity. That is why I'm joining my colleagues here today to announce that the Government of Canada is announcing $103 million in funding for the construction and operational support of 178 new shelter spaces and transitional homes for Indigenous women, children, and 2S LGBTQI+ people escaping family and gender-based violence. Today's announcement represents progress on the Government of Canada's federal pathway to address violence against women, girls, and 2S LGBTQI+ people. Ce financement permettra de répondre aux besoins urgents de nouvelles maisons d'hébergement et maisons de transition pour les Premières Nations, les Inuits et les Métis partout au pays, y compris dans les réserves, dans le nord et dans les régions urbaines. The impact of these new shelter spaces and transitional housing units cannot be understated. It will give Indigenous women, children, and 2S LGBTQI+ people an opportunity to live in a community that they know and love, to have a safe and a stable home, and to literally have a fresh start in life. These new Indigenous-led projects will offer survivors of family and gender-based violence access to culturally appropriate services that will aid in their journey of healing. As Wik-Wemikong First Nation eloquently expressed when they opened their own 13-unit shelter in 2018, these new shelter spaces and transitional housing units will provide future residents the opportunity to restore and revitalize Indigenous ways of being. C'est ce que ces nouveaux logements accompliront. These new shelters and transitional housing units are about investing in the health and well-being of Indigenous communities, not just today, but for future generations as well. Before I end, I'd like to once again thank everyone here and across different communities for their unwavering dedication to ensuring that Indigenous peoples have access to a safe and affordable place to call home. En travaillant ensemble, nous pouvons nous assurer que tout le monde est en chez-soi sous air abordable. Thank you, merci beaucoup. I now invite my colleague and friend, Minister Patty Hajdu.
Thanks very much, Ahmed. And first of all, before I begin, I just wanted to talk a little bit about the very concerning situations in Alberta and Saskatchewan with the extreme wildfire situation that we're seeing. It's affecting about 15 First Nations communities and many other communities, of course. And Indigenous Services Canada has been working nonstop with the leadership, including partners at the Government of Canada, to coordinate and ensure evacuees and community efforts are well supported. I spoke this week with with Chief Conray Sewepagam of Little Red River Cree Nation, some of the biggest fires impacting his communities. It's been a very difficult time, as you can well imagine, for everyone. Infrastructure is being lost. There are active efforts underway to try to protect what infrastructure is remaining, but it's very, very difficult, and I would say quite a treacherous situation. Indigenous Services Canada will continue to be there to support the 15 First Nations, and we're ensuring supports through the Emergency Management Assistance Program, which has actually just been reformed, thankfully, so that communities have the flexibility to acquire the equipment they need or the people that they need, and in a much more flexible way that allows for far faster action. Some of my colleagues, I think, later on will be providing an update on very specific issues around supporting communities in Alberta and Saskatchewan. So I'll leave it there for now, but I did want you to know that we've been working extensively over the weekend on supporting people, First Nations people in those communities. So I am very grateful to be here today as a person who used to run a homeless shelter, as someone who has seen firsthand the impacts in particular of gender-based violence and domestic violence on vulnerable women, 2S LGBTQ people, and children, of course, that are often left homeless or in very precarious situations when family dynamics escalate to such a scale that people have to flee. And of course, the challenge is that if there isn't a place to flee, families often will stay intact, if you will. Women and children, 2S LGBTQ people will stay in a space often that's very dangerous because there isn't any alternative. And that, of course, increases the risk of ongoing violence and the kinds of harms that the entire family faces, as a matter of fact, as those cycles of violence continue to escalate. So, of course, as the Minister of Indigenous Services, when I've met with thousands of Indigenous community members and leaders and activists across the country in the last 7.5 years, and oftentimes what comes up, especially in the space of gender-based violence and protecting Indigenous women and girls, 2S LGBTQ members, is the lack of supportive housing, shelters, or other kinds of transitional housing that help people move away from violence and start that really hard journey of rebuilding their lives. And so today's announcement means that there will be more than 175 new shelters and transition home spaces through 22 projects in 21 communities across the country. And what's really important to note is that while CMHC is providing the funding and the financing for the construction and capital costs, Indigenous Services Canada is supporting the operational costs, and those operational costs are critical, actually, to the functioning of shelters over the long term. And I can tell you, again, drawing from my previous experience, that stable funding, operational funding, is critical for communities and community organizations to be able to have the confidence that they're going to be able to do that good work, to be able to retain and keep staff that help with the relationships that families that are experiencing domestic violence rely on as they begin to do that healing. You know, shelters are not just a place, they're not just a cot. They are actually places where people get a lot of support, a lot of transitional support to actually figure out what those next steps are, and that relies on good financing that allows for the retention of staff and the kinds of supports that people need to move forward. So this is an example of the collaboration that can happen across, obviously, federal governments when we work together, but across the country when we work with not-for-profit organizations, communities, and activists who really do know what the grassroots needs, what community need, and what, importantly, women, 2S LGBTQ, and families of domestic violence need. And so I'm really pleased with this announcement today. I know that there's way more that we need to do on housing, and that's clearly evident every single day. I don't think any one of us is unaware of the work that is still ahead of us, but this is a very important piece, especially in First Nations communities where resources are so scarce. Thank you very much, and I'll now pass the mic over to Minister Miller.
Kwekwe ulukut Time to say hello. Bonjour. Okay. I think we can all agree this has been a long time coming. During the last election, we made a commitment to do something in response to the final report into missing murdered Indigenous women and girls in relation to its specific demand that the federal government support transitional housing and shelters across Canada, whether it's on reserve or another reality experienced by Indigenous peoples, particularly in urban settings. And so this is a big day, I think, for Indigenous communities and the proponents that have fought really hard to get their submissions in. And 22 projects around the country is going to be a game changer, and it's going to save lives. It is a direct response to the final report into murdered missing Indigenous women and girls, and it will make a difference in the lives of the most vulnerable, including the 2SL, Two-Spirit LGBTQ community across Canada. La mise à disposition de nouveaux refuges et de logements de transition pour les communautés des Premières Nations, des Inuits et des Métis dans le pays contribuera donc à assurer la sécurité des membres de ces communautés, notamment de ceux qui peuvent être victimes de violences familiales et sexistes. Nous savons à quel point la pandémie a causé une augmentation de ces cas et c'est le temps du fédéral d'agir. On Friday, we honored Red Dress Day, commemorating murdered missing Indigenous women and girls, and underlined the emergency that is continuing to fuel this national tragedy. What we've heard from around the country is that need for the federal government, as well as provincial and territorial and municipal governments, to be actively involved in infrastructure builds, but also in adapted supporting transitional housing for women and girls and those that are the most vulnerable. And again, this will save lives. Ceci va changer et va sauver des vies. I think it's important to highlight as well that this isn't the only initiative that the federal government has supported. Over the last 2 years, the federal government has supported 66 projects across Canada and Indigenous communities, principally to support safe spaces for those same vulnerable populations. And I think that is something that is added on top of what is announced today, as well as the work that is being done independently by Indigenous communities to keep their own safe. So today, it's important to highlight that for Indigenous women and girls and the 2S LGBTQ community, the statistics are shocking and continue to be shocking. Spousal violence of Indigenous women is 3 times higher than for non-Indigenous women. Indigenous women are killed at 6 times the rate of non-Indigenous women. And Indigenous 2S LGBTQ plus people face higher rates of violence than those who are not Indigenous. Lors de l'élaboration de la voie fédérale mentionnée par le ministre Hussen, les survivants, les familles, les dirigeants et les organisations autochtones nous ont dit clairement qu'une nouvelle approche était nécessaire et c'est aujourd'hui qu'on répand. Une approche qui s'attaque aux causes profondes de la violence, qui reconnaît l'ampleur du problème et qui tient compte des différentes expériences des peuples autochtones d'un bout à l'autre du pays. We consulted with Indigenous communities over the last little while, and they've clearly come up with proposals, and this is not the end of it. There will be more proposals coming in, and those will be rolled out in due course. I want to end this by saying that this is Canada responding to an emergency, but it's not all. There needs to be more done, and we'll continue to be there for those that are most vulnerable in this country, and we won't take any credit or even claim to take any credit until everyone is safe in this country. Thank you. Miigwech. Merci.
Thank you, Ministers. That concludes the speaking portion of this event. I would now like to open up to Q&A sessions with members of the media. Each member of the media has the opportunity to ask one question and one follow-up. Please state your name and organization prior to asking your questions. I would now like to, I'd like to open up for any questions.
Minister Miller, you just called this an emergency. Last week in the House of Commons, MPs unanimously decided to call on your government to declare a national state of emergency for missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls and Two-Spirit people. Why hasn't your government declared this national state of emergency yet?
Well, I think, first of all, I know that's the question you asked me on Friday, so I'll repeat that after having reflected over on the weekend. I think what people want to see is action on the federal government, and today is that action. As you saw, this was a unanimous motion supported by the government, and we'll continue to act on this. Words are important, but they're not all, and they're meaningless unless we're actually taking the proper measures. This is a tragedy, but if you've read the final report into missing murdered Indigenous women and girls, you know that if you react by tragedy, the result is tragic public policy. And so we need to move as quickly as possible. We need to take the time that's necessary to actually respond in a meaningful way. The historical settlement that we have achieved with the Caring Society, AFN, Chiefs of Ontario, and others is an example of that. Every child that's in care is a child that is increased in the risk of going missing and ultimately murdered in this country, and more often than not, at 6 times the rate, they are Indigenous. And so that is stuff that does not get fixed overnight. And we know that COVID has only increased vulnerability by people being shut in a confined space where violence is more often likely to occur. So I think action is what you'll need to see from the government, and more importantly, Indigenous peoples will want to see it. As to a formal statement by the government, that's something we're open to and glad to examine that.
So this is So this is $103 million in new money. What about the $150 million that's set to expire for other shelters that currently exist? What is your government going to do about those shelters that do serve Indigenous peoples?
So this, and perhaps Minister Hajdu is more appropriate to answer this because this falls under Indigenous Services Canada, but we're going to be there for communities. The operational funding was profiled in the last budget, in 2 budgets ago, over 5 years. This is the federal government putting its money where its mouth in areas where it hasn't been in the past. So that is exceedingly important, and those shelters do absolutely need the support. I want to stress also that there's a role for the provincial and territorial governments to be playing. We are in an area that they often say is not our jurisdiction, but yet they are not doing enough or sometimes not doing anything. So that's a word that's poisonous, jurisdiction to Indigenous peoples, and we need to sort ourselves out internally to make sure that we're putting our best foot forward in helping people stay safe.
All right. Is there any other questions?
Sorry, I just might add that we're not going to let money lapse. So if there is money that isn't spent as a result of any of the any of the components, and as Marc just illustrated, there's multiple players in the space and multiple places where there might be delays, but we will not let money go back to the general revenue account. It'll be reprofiled and used for shelters.
So for the Needham EP Canada News. So just in talking to some of the groups that, Indigenous housing and shelter groups, one of the criticisms has been that the government hasn't really consulted with them in shelter and housing, and also there's criticism about flowing some money through CHMC. So, and I see politicians here today, but I don't see any housing groups. So I guess my question to you is, who did you consult with in deciding these spaces and where they would go?
Is there a specific question to a specific minister?
Well, it doesn't matter. I'll start, and then maybe Ahmed can speak about the decision around the CMHC funding, but I can tell you that the way that the funding from Indigenous Services Canada flows is specific to the community, and the communities design how the program will look. The communities design how the program will operate. That's how it becomes culturally appropriate, because it's designed by First Nations, specific to those First Nations, with the perspective of that leadership group and the community process that they've chosen. And I'll turn to Minister Hussen to speak about the successful projects.
Yeah, and just to add to what Minister Hajdu said, CMHC is the vehicle in which the money goes through, but the committee composed of different community members have actually been making the decisions in terms of approving projects. They're the ones who have been examining the urgency of the matter and making sure that they encourage folks to apply and conclude agreements so that money can flow as quickly as possible. So it's actually being made, the decisions are being made by the community.
Fair enough, but you're making a $103 million announcement here. Can you tell me which specific communities and which groups you
I'm
consulted
happy,
with?
yeah, the more than 20 communities, I'm happy to provide that list to you from my team.
You can't provide it today, though?
It's not for this. It's in the press release. We can read them out if you'd like, but it is in the press release.
Is there any other questions?
Didn't want to go down the list.
Know if you were planning to go to Alberta to speak to any of these leaders in person or visit any communities?
I didn't speak personally to any leaders in Alberta, no. I was focused on supporting First Nations communities and working within the Government of Canada to secure commitment in a variety of different spaces to make sure that the chiefs could move forward with their attempts to protect their property.
So no plans to go to Alberta at this time?
Oh, for me?
For the wildfire situation, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, certainly if that is something that allows for, in my schedule and I think more importantly in theirs, I can tell you right now, everybody's exhausted. The conversations that I had over the weekend, in some cases I could hear fire in the background. So there is a lot happening. I think if people want me to be there, of course I'll make myself available, but we wouldn't impose our visit in the middle of the crisis. I think there will come a time, though, of course, where I'll want to visit, as I have in other areas of disaster on the East Coast, for example, or on the West Coast with the torrential rains. And so I will be there. We'll work with communities to make sure that it doesn't pose an additional burden.
Is there any other questions? If there's no other questions, I think that concludes our scrum here, but also we would like to ask the ministers just to step forward for a quick photo for us. Jason, can you get us a photo?